I used to laugh whenever people talked about destiny. They said that somewhere in the world there was one person whose path was already connected to mine. Someone I would recognize without knowing why. I never believed any of it. Life had taught me that nothing was guaranteed, not happiness, not love, and certainly not fairy tales. Every morning I woke before sunrise, made my coffee, drove through the same streets, worked the same long hours, and returned to an apartment that was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the kitchen clock from every room. Friends had long since married. Family gatherings became uncomfortable because every conversation eventually turned into the same question: when will you settle down? I always smiled, shrugged, and changed the subject, but deep inside I wondered the same thing. Maybe some people simply weren't meant to find their person. Maybe I had already missed my chance without even realizing it. Still, every now and then, a strange feeling would appear. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more like a whisper in the back of my mind telling me that my story wasn't finished yet. I couldn't explain it. So I ignored it and kept moving forward with life. Then one ordinary Tuesday changed everything. The morning began like every other day except for one tiny inconvenience. My car refused to start. I tried again and again until I finally accepted defeat. Annoyed, I called for a rideshare, but the wait was over 40 minutes. Running late, I decided to walk to the nearby train station instead. It had been years since I used public transportation. The station was crowded with people rushing in every direction, each one focused on their own life. I stood on the platform checking emails while barely paying attention to anything around me. A train arrived, the doors opened, and everyone pushed inside. I found one empty seat by the window and continued scrolling through work messages. A few stops later, someone sat across from me. I didn't look up immediately. It wasn't until I heard a soft laugh that I raised my eyes. She was smiling while trying to keep a stack of books from falling onto the floor. One finally slipped, landing near my shoes. I picked it up before it could slide away. She thanked me with a smile so genuine that, for a brief second, the noisy train seemed completely silent. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks or slow-motion moments. It was simply one smile from a complete stranger. Yet, something inside me felt strangely familiar. She noticed the cover of the book I had picked up and laughed again. "That's my favorite one," she said. I admitted I had never read it. She looked surprised and insisted I was missing out. Before I could answer, the train reached the next station. She gathered her books, stood up, smiled one last time, and disappeared into the crowd before I even realized I hadn't asked her name. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet for the rest of the day I couldn't stop thinking about it, not because she was beautiful, although she certainly was, but because I felt as though I had just remembered someone I had somehow forgotten. It made no logical sense. I convinced myself I was simply tired and returned to work. Days passed. Meetings filled my calendar. Deadlines consumed my attention. Gradually the memory faded until the following weekend, when I wandered into a small neighborhood bookstore to escape an unexpected rainstorm. The familiar smell of old pages filled the room. I walked through the narrow aisles without searching for anything specific. Then I heard the same laugh again. My heart actually skipped. I turned around, and there she was, standing on a small ladder, reaching for a book on the top shelf. She looked at me for a second, before her eyes widened in recognition. "Train guy," she said with a grin. I couldn't help laughing. "Book girl," I answered. Somehow the awkwardness disappeared instantly. We talked for nearly an hour without noticing the time. We spoke about books, travel, favorite childhood memories, embarrassing moments, and dreams we had never shared with anyone else. Every conversation seemed to lead naturally into another. There were no uncomfortable silences. It felt less like meeting someone new and more like continuing a conversation that had been paused years ago. When the rain finally stopped, neither of us seemed eager to leave. She suggested coffee at a small cafe around the corner. I agreed without hesitation. We sat by the window watching people hurry through puddles while talking about everything and nothing. She told me she had recently moved back to the city after taking care of her grandmother in another state. I shared stories about my work and how routine had quietly taken over my life. She admitted she often believed life had a strange way of redirecting people exactly when they needed it most. I smiled politely, still pretending I didn't believe in destiny, but somewhere inside that familiar whisper returned. Before leaving, we exchanged phone numbers. As we walked in opposite directions, she turned around and waved. For reasons I couldn't explain, that small gesture stayed with me all evening. Over the next several weeks, we saw each other often. Sometimes we planned it, other times it happened by complete accident, or at least what looked like an accident. We bumped into each other at the farmer's market, a city festival, and even the same tiny restaurant neither of us knew the other liked. Each coincidence made us laugh. She joked that the universe was getting less subtle every week. I rolled my eyes, pretending to disagree, but I secretly started looking forward to every unexpected encounter. My apartment no longer felt as empty, because every evening ended with long conversations over the phone. We discovered we both loved thunderstorms, old movies, quiet places, handwritten letters, and sunrise walks more than crowded parties. We also shared fears we had never admitted aloud. She worried she would never truly belong anywhere. I confessed that I feared ending up alone. After spending so much of my life convincing myself I was fine, instead of judging me, she simply listened. One evening we sat on a hill overlooking the city lights. The air was cool, and neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. Have you ever had a dream that stayed with you for years? I nodded slowly. I had never told anyone about it. Since my early 20s, I had occasionally dreamed about standing on a crowded street, searching for someone whose face I could never clearly see. Every time I woke up, just before finding her, she looked at me with quiet surprise before admitting she had experienced something strangely similar. In her dream, she was always carrying books through a train station, looking for someone she somehow already knew. Neither of us laughed. Neither of us could explain it. We simply sat there in silence as the city lights shimmered below us, both wondering the same impossible thought. The silence between us that evening felt different from any silence I had ever experienced. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't awkward. It felt as if both of us were standing on the edge of discovering something that had been waiting for years to be uncovered. Neither of us tried to explain the dreams because they sounded impossible. Instead, we watched the city lights below us while the cool breeze carried the distant sounds of traffic. Finally, she smiled and gently shook her head. Maybe it's just a strange coincidence, she said. I nodded. But deep inside, I no longer believed in coincidences. Too many unexpected moments had brought us together. The broken car, the train, the bookstore, the cafe, every step that had once seemed random now felt connected in a way I couldn't understand. Over the following months, our friendship quietly became something much deeper. We didn't rush anything. There were no dramatic confessions or grand romantic speeches. We simply chose each other every day. Morning messages became part of our routine. Weekend breakfast turned into long afternoon walks through parks and quiet neighborhoods. We celebrated small victories together and supported each other through difficult days. For the first time in years, I looked forward to tomorrow instead of simply getting through today. Even my coworkers noticed the difference. They joked that I smiled more often. They weren't wrong. She had a way of making ordinary moments feel meaningful. A simple cup of coffee tasted better when she was sitting across the table. A walk through the city felt like an adventure when she was beside me, pointing out little details everyone else ignored. One Saturday, she invited me to help clean out her late grandmother's old house before it was sold. The small home was filled with photographs, handwritten recipes, dusty books, and memories from another generation. We spent hours carefully packing boxes while laughing at old family stories. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, she opened an old wooden chest hidden beneath a staircase. Inside were dozens of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon, several photo albums, and a worn leather journal. Curious, she opened the journal while I continued sorting books nearby. A few moments later, she called my name, but her voice sounded unusually quiet. I walked over and saw her staring at a page without speaking. She handed me the journal. My eyes immediately stopped on a photograph tucked inside. It showed two young couples smiling together nearly 30 years earlier. One couple was her grandparents. The other couple looked strangely familiar. My heart began beating faster. I reached for my wallet and pulled out an old family photograph I had carried for years because it was one of the few pictures of my late parents. They were the same people, the same day, the same location, the same photograph from a different angle. We looked at each other in complete disbelief. Neither of us knew what to say. We spent the next hour reading through the journal. Her grandmother had written about lifelong friends she lost contact with after both families moved to different states. Those friends were my parents. They had shared holidays together, celebrated birthdays together, and even joked that if they ever had children around the same age, they hoped they would become lifelong friends too. Life had separated the families before that could happen. There was no arranged future or magical promise, just an innocent wish written in faded ink decades ago. Somehow, after all those years, we had found each other without anyone planning it. I couldn't stop smiling as I closed the journal. Our parents actually knew each other, I whispered. She laughed through tears, and we spent years believing we were complete strangers. That discovery changed everything. It didn't create our feelings, but it made every coincidence feel a little less impossible. We visited my parents' hometown together and found places both families had once visited. We talked with elderly neighbors who still remembered them. One woman smiled after looking at us. For several seconds, "You two look like you were always supposed to meet," she said. Normally, I would have dismissed a comment like that, but this time I simply smiled. As the seasons changed, our relationship continued to grow. We learned each other's strengths and weaknesses. We argued occasionally, apologized quickly, and never let pride become more important than understanding. We supported each other's dreams instead of competing with them. She encouraged me to finally start the business I had postponed for years because I was afraid of failing. I encouraged her to publish the children's stories she had secretly written since college. Watching her hold the first printed copy of her book was one of the happiest moments of my life. Watching my business open its doors, with her standing beside me, felt just as meaningful. One autumn evening, nearly a year after the train ride that started everything, I asked her to meet me at the same station, where we had first seen each other. She arrived carrying a familiar stack of books and immediately laughed. "This feels strangely familiar," she said. "It does," I answered. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the very same book that had fallen near my feet on that first train ride. Months earlier, I had quietly bought my own copy and asked the bookstore owner to hide it for this day. Inside the front cover, I had written one sentence: "Future wife." I knew we'd meet someday. Today was just the beginning. She opened the book, read the words, and looked up at me with tears in her eyes before I even knelt down. I held out the ring and smiled. "Will you marry me?" For a second she couldn't speak. Then she laughed, cried, nodded repeatedly, and whispered the one word I had dreamed of hearing: "Yes." People walking through the station noticed what was happening and began clapping. A little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed toward us with the biggest smile. An elderly couple stopped to congratulate us. The train arrived, its doors opened, and for a brief moment it looked exactly as it had 1 year earlier. The difference was that this time neither of us was walking away. As we stood together, she quietly took my hand and smiled. "You know," she said, "maybe destiny isn't about magic." I looked at her. Maybe it's simply about two people who never stop moving forward until the right moment finally arrives. I squeezed her hand. For years I had searched for certainty in life and found only questions, yet the answer had been waiting in an ordinary Tuesday, on an ordinary train, in the smile of a stranger carrying too many books. Sometimes the greatest love stories don't begin with perfect timing. They begin with unexpected moments that seem insignificant, until you look back and realize every step was leading you toward the person who would change your life forever. And that was the day I finally understood why that quiet whisper had never disappeared. It wasn't telling me to keep searching. It was telling me to keep going, because somewhere ahead, my future wife was already walking toward me.